Welcome back to Raised by Giants, where we talk all things spirituality. I'm Ryder Lee. Tonight we have scientist, futurist, award-winning author Stephan A. Schwartz. But before I introduce him, check out Raised by Giants on Rokfin. It's a completely uncensored platform. Go over there, set up a free account, get all of my regular content that I post here on YouTube, and sign up for Rokfin's premium content, which is far less than a YouTube premium account at only $10 a month. And you'll get all of my premium uncensored content when it gets released and all of the other creators' premium content as well. Check the link in the description to sign up for the video streaming platform Rokfin. Also, check out C60 Purple Power. It is the most powerful antioxidant on the planet, helps with energy levels, skin problems, infections, eyesight, brain cognition, EMF radiation, and a lot more. It's a free radical sponge that gives your body the ability to heal itself. And if you use promo code Giants10 from the link in the description, you'll get 10% off your entire purchase. Highly recommend it. Been using it for over a year now with my own money, and I would not recommend something that doesn't work. So without further ado, introducing tonight's guest, scientist, futurist, award-winning author of both fiction and nonfiction, Stephan A. Schwartz. He is a distinguished associate scholar of the California Institute for Human Science. He is a columnist for the journal Explorer and editor of the daily web publication Schwartzreport.net, and both of which he covers trends that are affecting the future. For over 40 years as an experimentalist, he has been studying the nature of consciousness. In addition to his nonfiction books and novels, he is the author of more than 250 technical reports, papers, academic book chapters, prefaces, and introductions. His work has been covered worldwide by numerous magazines, newspapers, and television productions. Hello, Stephan. Welcome to the show. Thanks so much for coming on. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. Happy to do it, Ryder.
Thank you. And it's an honor to have you. I've been doing a really deep dive into the government DIA Stargate project and trying to interview as many people as possible from that project. And I know that you weren't involved in that project, but you did create some of the remote viewing protocols. And from my understanding, kind of pioneered a lot of the remote viewing and putting it out into the field. So since it's your first time on the show, let's start off with that. How did this all start for you? How did you get into doing this research into consciousness and remote viewing?
I got started as an experimentalist as a result of reading all of the Edgar Cayce readings. In many ways, he is the most carefully documented remote viewer in history. And my interest from the beginning was not, is it real? So I wasn't interested in those kind of experiments. My interest was, how does it work? What can we do to make it work better, more effectively? And what can we do of practical importance and utility? And what is it telling us about who we are as human beings and our place in the matrix of consciousness? So my experiments from the beginning, and I began years before SRI began. I started in 1968. And as I said, I got started because Cayce kept saying other people could do this. And so I started doing research about it. And I realized that people have been remote viewing, they didn't call it that, for thousands of years. I mean, the oldest recorded remote viewing that we have is in the 46th chapter of Herodotus's Histories of the World, and that dates to the 5th century BCE. So, and it's exactly the way we would do it today. Croesus, who we say as rich as Croesus, the reason we say that is because he began the coining of money, got a note that got notice that he was going to be attacked by the Persians. He was the king of Lydia, which was then what is now a part of Turkey. And he was very concerned about what he could do. So he had 7 teams created, and he sent them out to the 7 oracles of the Greek world, who were themselves remote viewers in today. I mean, let me also say, remote viewing, a term coined by Ingo Swann back in the 70s, is a terrible term because it has nothing to do with remote, it has nothing to do with viewing. But it's the name that has stuck, and the term that has stuck. Anyway, so he sent these 7 teams out, and he said that they were to wait 100 days. It took them a long time to get to the 7 oracles. And on the 100th day, they were to go in and ask, what is Croesus, son of Alyattes, king of the Lydians, doing? And the only answer we know is the oracle at Delphi, which these were young women called Pythonesses, who were placed in over a crack in the earth that in a little tripod seat that had hydrocarbons that had psychoactive properties. The young Pythoness, when they went in, before they even asked the questions, she said, I can count the sands of time, the 100 days, and I see a great bronze urn, a pot, and a big bronze lid, and boiling water, and a hare and a tortoise being thrown into the pot of water, which made absolutely no sense to them. But they wrote it all down, and they went back. This is a typical outbound experiment, by the way. And when they got back, Herodotus tells us that Croesus, upon hearing it, knelt down and gave obeisance to the oracle of Delphi, because he had thought to himself on the 100th day, what should I be doing? Something that you wouldn't guess. I mean, if he said he was sitting on a throne issuing edicts, I mean, well, that's what a king would do. So he had this big bronze pot brought into his courtyard of his palace, and a fire built underneath it, and a big bronze lid, and he cut up a hare and a tortoise and threw them into the thing, exactly what she had described. And that's the oldest remote viewing we have on record. But the idea of remote viewing, as I discovered as I began doing this research, I realized, as I said, that people have been doing this for thousands of years. They just didn't call it remote viewing. It really should be called non-local perception, because it's a matter of opening to non-local consciousness and accessing data. And the oracles of Delphi, those 7 oracles, that's an example. The oracle of Siwa, the Egyptians, the talking idol of Siwa, that's an example. The talking idol of Ixchel for the Mayans, that's an example. There's a tribal group in the mountains of Colombia called the Kogi who are still doing it. That is, taking a group of talented young people and training them how to attain and sustain intention-focused awareness, which is the key to the whole thing. There is, contrary to what you will see, there is so much disinformation about remote viewing. There is no one best way to remote view. I've tested 23,000 people, and I tell you that categorically, and history makes it very clear. In any case, as I said, I got interested in this. I was about 24 years old, 25 years old, and I started out, because I didn't actually believe it was possible, I created a grid in my garden, in my back garden in Virginia Beach. Originally had 12 squares, and I got up to 144. And I would bury things in mason jars or in 35 millimeter film cans, because I was interested in did size make a difference? And I made a mimeograph. That's how old this is. We're talking 1968, 67. I would send out a picture to people in the mail, a mimeograph sheet showing the grid, and I would say to people all over the world, because I wanted to see whether distance made any difference, and I would say, I have buried something in the grid. Can you locate that object in the grid? And can you describe for me what it is? And I discovered people could do it. And it didn't make any difference how far away they were. People in Japan or in Germany or in Brazil, it didn't make any difference. Or people, down the street from where I lived, didn't make any difference at all. And they were successfully able to do it. So that answered the question for me, is this all real? And so my question, as I said, was, what can we do to make it better? And I also became very interested because I looked at all the criticism of parapsychological research, and it was all stuff about, well, you could have, your facial expression could have told them that they were giving correct information, or they secretly had literally, this is true, they drilled a hole in the ceiling and they had somebody looking down into just all kinds of nonsense. And I thought, well, I'm not interested in dealing with any of that, so I'm going to do only triple blind experiments. So all of my experiments were triple blind. Triple blind means I didn't know the answer, the remote viewer didn't know the answer, and in fact, nobody knew the answer. So if they were able to get correct information, it had to be non-locally sourced because there was no one alive that actually knew the information. And because I come out of an anthropological background, at that time in archaeology, the big discussion that was going on was where to look. Most archaeological finds were made serendipitously. Either a farmer was plowing a field and turned up a tomb, or a road crew was building a road and found a temple, or something like that. So the big question in archaeology, where to look, because most things, as I say, were found serendipitously. And the other part that made it attractive to me is it allowed me to compare what you could find using electronic remote sensing, that is, proton precession magnetometers, side scan sonar, ground penetrating radar, blah, blah, blah. All of those electronic search techniques, it would allow me to compare whether you could find the things the remote viewers were able to find if you could find them electronically. And so that was very attractive to me. It was a very rigorous protocol because, as I said, my interest was not in proving that it worked or that it was real, because I didn't have any doubt about that. What I wanted to know, as I said, was how do we make it work better? What can we do of practical utility? And the archaeological experiments lent themselves to the problem, lent themselves to that kind of a solution. And so I did a lot of research, and I wrote a book called The Secret Vaults of Time, which is about all of the use of remote sensing, non-local perception in archaeology in the years before I became involved. And I realized other people had been doing this. And so I started out doing it. And the other question that interested me was, at that time, we're talking now late 60s, very early 70s, the general thinking in parapsychology was that it was probably an electromagnetic phenomena involving ELF, extreme low frequency electromagnetic radiation, 300 to 300 hertz. So I wanted to see if that was true. I left Virginia Beach and went up to Washington, D.C., Anyway, I became the special assistant to the chief of naval operations under a man named Elmo Zumwalt. And I had a friend who was the head of the CIA, and he began sending me translations of research done by a man named Leonid Vasiliev in Russia, in the Soviet Union, who also asked the question, is this electromagnetic? And he had put people down into caves and down into mine shafts and put them into Faraday cages which block EM radiation in the caves, in the mine shafts. And he found that didn't make any difference. But the question wasn't fully answered because he said there might be a part of the electromagnetic spectrum, ELF, that could explain it. And I went to a guy named Hyman Rickover, who was the father of the American nuclear navy, and I asked him if he would let me do the experiment that Vasiliev wanted to do but had never been able to do, and that is put somebody in a submarine at depth and see if they could do a remote viewing, because that would block the electromagnetic radiation. And he didn't want to do it because he thought that it would get a lot of publicity, it would get out, and that would draw a lot of attention to the nuclear missile-armed submarines, part of the American defense, the triad, and he just didn't have any interest in that. So he told me, it's an interesting experiment, but no, I'm not going to do it. And I thought, well, that probably won't happen then, because where do you get a submarine? And then when I got a fellowship out in Los Angeles, and I went out, and two friends of mine who had just retired from the Navy had taken over the Institute of Marine and Coastal Studies at the University of Southern California, and they told me they would give me a submarine for 3 days that had come down to do its sea trials, and that would allow me to test whether it was electromagnetic. It is not.
Yeah, I was getting ready to say, this is just a rumor that I had heard, is that the government had set up some kind of devices to detect if anybody was remote viewing. This was back whenever they thought that it was EMF or ELF or whatever kind of frequencies, and they would try and set these things up in the room to try and detect if there was an actual remote viewing going on. But obviously it wouldn't work because it's not EMF.
No, and the story isn't true either. That's part of that's, as I say, there is so much misinformation about this. No, the SRI program began, actually, interestingly enough, the Russians learned about what they thought was an experiment that the Americans had done aboard the Nautilus submarine, the first nuclear submarine, in which they had done a remote perception experiment. Now, in fact, that didn't happen either. It was created by a Dutch writer who wrote it up in a book. And people in the American government read that, and they became convinced that the Russians were doing this remote viewing, well, not remote viewing, but this non-local perception research, and they thought, we better get into the game, or we're going to be outclassed, and they'll have an advantage on us. And that's part of what drove it. And then Russell Targ went down to von Braun, the German scientist who had come out of after the war, Second War, and gotten involved in the American space program. And Russell met him and told him about an experiment that he wanted to do, and that was able to get the funding, which was able to get it started. And there were a group of people in the Congress who thought this was a good thing to do. There were also a group in the Congress who thought it was evil, it was demonic, and that had it made a difference too. But so the government began doing it, and it was quite successful. but there were people who didn't like it and didn't like some of the people who were involved with it. And so it ended up, it went from SRI to SAIC, which was an organization run by a friend of mine, Robert Inman, Bobby Ray Inman, who became the head of NSA and then went over to SAIC. And at that point, Ed May was running it. And then it lost its funding. Not because it wasn't successful, but for other issues.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, I agree with back to the actual remote viewing part of this. I agree with Russell Targ whenever he says that everybody has these abilities, right? Everyone has the ability to remote view. We're basically born with the abilities. Do you agree with that?
Well, that isn't quite what Russ is saying, and I wouldn't say that. I would say to you that the ability to open to non-local awareness is first of all, the key to it is the ability to attain and sustain intention-focused awareness. That's why meditators routinely do better than non-meditators. And why throughout the thousands of years of history, meditation has been one of the keys. The oracles of Delphi, went into a meditative state. It's the ability to attain and sustain intention-focused awareness. Everybody has that capacity because we are ultimately, let me put it differently, because there is a continuity of consciousness, that is, there was an aspect of you that existed before you were born and that will continue after you're dead, the eternal self, what religion calls the soul. And so everyone has some capacity to access this part of their consciousness. It's spread through the population like any other, in terms of ability, like any other human skill. That is, there is a small group of people at one end of the group that are quite gifted at it. It has nothing to do with their education. It has nothing to do with any of the things that you would normally think about. And there's a few people at the other end of the group that either cannot or will not give themselves permission to have the experience, and most of us fall in the middle somewhere. It's a bell curve. So there are certain personality characteristics that make a difference. Severely analytical people don't tend to do very well at it. Artistic people, creative people tend to do much better than severely analytical people. But as I say, it's a bell curve. And you have a certain ability, and you can augment that ability by developing some technique, and there's any number of ways to do it, of attaining and sustaining intention-focused awareness.
There's like a common thread that I've seen amongst remote viewers, amongst most of them, and psychics, is a trauma aspect, right? They all went through a hardcore trauma in their life. And that was how they were able to separate their consciousness from their body. And then they were able to tap in better to these abilities. I mean, Ego Swan talked about this too. He had an out of body experience. He remembered being outside of his body whenever he was really young because he was made fun of a lot whenever he was younger for being gay. And it doesn't matter that he's gay. Who cares? But the thing that does matter is the trauma aspect. So is that something that you've ran into too, that a lot of these...
That's a very interesting question. Certainly, I mean, the really good remote viewers, Ingo, yes, Ingo was gay and he was bullied. he created he created a technique of remote viewing called CRV, controlled remote viewing, and he did it. In fact, I had lunch with him. He was also a Scientologist. That's something very few people know. Everybody except Russ Targ and Hella Hamid in the SRI program were Scientologists. Hal, Ed May, Ingo. And Ingo would come down. I was in LA running the Mobius Society, my laboratory, and stay with me. And we like to go to a spa. And one day we were at this spa, and Ingo had just started with the Army. And he said, I'm going to create a technique. And I've been bullied all my life by macho guys, and I'm going to be the bully. I'm going to be the boss and tell them how to do it. I'm going to create this cadre of people. And he even had a little badge that he thought they would get awarded, like a submarine for a submariner. And he drew me a picture of it on a napkin. I still have it. And so he created this technique, which he himself actually didn't use. But yes, he had trauma. That's a very interesting question. George McMullen, the best archaeological viewer, period. George also had trauma. He grew up in an evangelical family, and when he predicted that a school friend should not go to summer camp because he would drown, and it actually happened, the minister of the church that his family belonged to, stood him up in front of the congregation and said he was demonic. So yes, that's true. Hella Hamid came from a German family, and they were Jews, and they left. They just literally at the last minute, being able to do it, were able to get out of Germany. So yes, that was traumatic. I don't know about Alan Vaughan. I don't know if he had any particular trauma. Michael Crichton. Michael was, well, first of all, he was extremely tall. He was 7 feet something.
Wow.
And I suspect that just being that tall, particularly when you're a young boy, must have been difficult. Ryder, I don't know the absolute answer to that. I would have to do more research than that. But yeah, that's a very interesting question. Did childhood trauma give them the ability to open to non-local consciousness? I don't know. I'll do research and I'll get back to you. I don't know the answer.
Yes, please do, because I find that very fascinating. And basically, all of the psychics and remote viewers that I've talked to in my personal life and on this show, they've all suffered some sort of trauma. They've some kind of childhood trauma. So it only kind of makes sense that maybe these abilities were unlocked more to them through this trauma, through their life. And then, that was maybe like a fast track, because I think that we do have the ability to do this. All of us, but
again, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Again, if trauma is an issue, and I'm not saying that it is, I don't know the answer to that question. It is, the one thing that we do know is that this ability to attain and sustain intention-focused awareness is the key to the whole business. And it may be that trauma fixates you in some way. I just don't know the answer to that. But I know a number of remote viewers who I don't think had any particular trauma. I mean, Judith Orloff, for instance, is a good remote viewer, and I don't know that I just don't know the answer to enough people to be able to make a statement like that. Certainly the oracles, the Greek oracles or the Mayan oracle or the Egyptian oracle, all those, the only trauma that I can think is that they were taken away from their families when they were children, and whether that played a role, I don't know. I don't
I just
know.
think it's interesting. It's a very interesting component of
Yeah, it
art that
is.
I discovered.
It's an interesting idea, and I just don't know the answer.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. So, e- Ego Swan, he apparently wrote some of these protocols to train military personnel in the Stargate project. Is that correct?
Well, he created a technique for remote viewing, which he trained the people in the Army in how to do it. It was not a technique that he himself used. He used a part of it. But as I said, Ingo created it because he wanted to be the authority, and he was going to be the boss, the head guy, because he had been bullied as a boy for being a little gay kid, and it had been very traumatic for him. So he created this technique. But as I said earlier, there is no one way to do this. There are any number of techniques that have been used through the centuries that so there isn't any one way. There's no best way. As I said, I tested 23,000 people, and because I wanted to answer that question, is there a better way to do it? And the key, again, the one defining thing is meditators do better than non-meditators. And the reason they do that is because they learn how to attain and sustain intention-focused awareness. The other thing is that people who test strongly analytically tend not to do as well as people who test strongly creative, using various psychological profiles.
So, what's the difference between controlled remote viewing and coordinate remote viewing? Because, from my understanding, coordinate remote viewing has absolutely nothing to do with the target itself. It's just a way to document the session. Is that correct?
Well, the one is I'll give you the longitude and latitude of some place, and you tell me what's there. And that was a technique that was started at SRI, and it turned out people could do it. I mean, we've tried all kinds of things. None of it seems to, I used to send people questions in sealed envelopes and ask them to answer the question, but they didn't see the question because it was in a sealed envelope. And that worked. No, the key to it, it's not that complicated. The key to it is this ability to attain and sustain intention-focused awareness. And you can do that in any number of ways, religiously, psychologically. If you look, for instance, at the world's religions, you will discover that all of them begin because a single individual has a non-local consciousness experience. Jesus gets baptized by John. He goes into the desert to meditate, and he awakens. Muhammad goes to the sacred cave of Hira, where he meditates and awakens and has a non-local consciousness experience. The Buddha goes to ashram, where he's taught to meditate, and he awakens. So what you see when you look at this is that this business of learning how to attain and sustain intention-focused awareness, wherever in the geography or the time of history or whatever, and with all the various techniques, that's what gives people the ability to do it. And I tell people that I have taught remote view. I do an online course. You go to glidewing.org, I teach people how to meditate. Because, as I said, the key thing that I have found in 50 years of doing this, over 50 years, is that meditators, because of this ability that they get by meditating, however they do it, produces the ability to open to non-local awareness. The point that we have to remember is, in 1931, Max Planck was interviewed by the Observer newspaper, and they asked him, he's the father of quantum mechanics, and they asked him, you and Einstein are the two most famous scientists in the world. What have you learned? And I think they thought he was going to talk about atoms or molecules or something, I don't know. But what he said was, what I have learned from all my research is that consciousness is causal and fundamental. Space-time arises from consciousness, not consciousness from space-time. You cannot get behind consciousness. It is the fundamental. So once you get that, and you understand that we are, at our essence, beings of consciousness that manifest physically, and that what we call space-time, reality, is in fact a manifestation of consciousness. So what you're talking about with remote viewing, again, it's an awful term, is the ability to open to this part of yourself that connects to the eternal aspect of yourself, the soul part. I call it the eternal self. And
wouldn't that be the separation of consciousness from the body? No, wouldn't that be a representation of like what you just explained with Jesus and Buddha and all that, going through that meditative state to get your consciousness outside of your body? And then that's another way that...
No, it's not. No, it's not about getting outside of your body. That's a spatial... Just think about that comment for a minute. That's a spatial comment. Getting outside of your body. This has nothing to do with space. It's about opening to an aspect of consciousness. Now, if you have an out-of-body experience, you have a very strong experience of being outside of the body, but you don't have to... Remote viewing does not require you to get out of the body. It's not about spatial things. If you think about just the way people talk about it, it's about opening. This is an aspect of your consciousness that you have all the time. Normally, what happens with most people, most of the time, is that what they call thinking is overwhelmingly regulated by their neuroanatomy. It's hot, it's cold, it's dark, it's light. There's a good smell, there's a bad smell, or just sort of trivial stuff. Oh, did I turn my lights off when I parked the car? Did I feed my cat? That kind of stuff. And what you're doing in remote viewing, if you are successful at it, or not just in remote viewing, by the way, but in therapeutic intention, that's another example. What you're doing is you are allowing that stimulation from your neuroanatomy and all of this sort of trivial thought to retreat into the background so that this other aspect of yourself, what religion calls the still small voice, and there is a direct correlation between creativity, spiritual epiphany, and non-local perception. If you look at if you listen to what people say, who we think of as the enormously historically important creative thinkers, you will find that they all tell you the same story. Poincaré says, I was walking across the street when I had a vision. and it explained to me how to do my mathematics. Tesla says, I'm walking across Central Park when I have a vision of the electric motor, and he went back and told his engineers to make it, not to prototype it, but just to do exactly what he told them, and then they plugged it in and it worked. Or Einstein says he saw the relativity one day after he had been sick and he was idling away in an afternoon in his canoe. Or Descartes says he has 3 dreams in which his mathematics, what he becomes historically significant about, his mathematics is revealed. Jonas Salk told me, we were walking past into Salk Institute down in San Diego, and I said to him, how did you come up with the idea of the polio vaccine? And he said, I got it in a dream. So dreaming is a way in which all of this other stuff retreats into the background. And so people have, Kulka has the benzene ring dream that you probably know about. I mean, when you look at these examples over and over and over and over again, Leonardo would stare at a wall that had water that had run down the wall, leaving a pattern, and he would just zone out, as he said, and then these creative ideas would come to him. So if you look at people who are historically significant as creative individuals, or as spiritual leaders, or as remote viewers, you see that all of them describe in different words, but they all describe the idea that they have opened their consciousness to a level of consciousness they had previously not been aware of. And that's the key to the thing.
So a remote viewer is actually viewing something inside of themselves. It's not outside of them.
No, again, remote viewers are acquiring information about informational architectures which are manifested in the physical realm by whatever it is you're asking them to describe. They're not going there. There's no going, there's no signal, there's no sender, there's no receiver. There is an opening process, and you acquire information. The 2 big important questions, for which I have no answer, nor does anybody else, but the 2 big questions are, what is consciousness and what is information? We know, for instance, in the reincarnation research, that people come across from one lifetime to another, and they come in with scar tissue or with birthmarks or other physical manifestations of something that occurred to them in a previous life. We know from something like 13 million Americans have had near-death experiences. And when you look at the near-death experiences, they describe this same idea, that I'm in another state of consciousness, and in this state of consciousness I have access to information that I would not otherwise be able to know. So what we're dealing with is to recognize that we live what we call reality, the space-time we call reality, is in fact a manifestation of consciousness. It's an information architecture. And that when you ask someone to remote view, however you ask them, what they are doing is opening, it's like doing a Google. In fact, it's exactly like doing a Google. In the non-local domain, there is the everything, because we know that people can describe things that haven't happened yet. I mean, for instance, I'm doing an experiment now where I'm asking people to predict something that no one knows how it's going to come out. I asked them on Thursday to tell me how it's going to come out on Friday. Nobody knows. It's triple blind. We've been doing it for almost 2 years. We have a 76.8 hit rate. So where do they get that information? When I ask people to describe Cleopatra's palace that has been lost for thousands of years or several thousand years, where do they go to get that information? They don't go anywhere. That's the point. When I ask people to describe where Christopher Columbus's caravel from his fourth voyage is located, where is that information? And the answer is it's not anywhere in space-time. It is in the information architecture, the great Google, as it were, and that when you learn how to open to this aspect of the self, you can get information about anything. And that, in fact, is part of what freaks people out about it, because what you get when you recognize this is there are no secrets.
Okay, so if it's not something, if you're not separating your consciousness to view something and it's not happening within you, then and you're switching into a different consciousness, that entire consciousness would have to be the same. Because if it wasn't the same, then you would get different people getting different things when they're remote view according to their perception of reality and based off of their experiences.
No, they're not.
Why would they not?
Because, well, let me say, people are biased in remote viewing. That is, for instance, I'll give you a very specific example. I told you earlier, George McMullen was held up in front of the congregation of the evangelical church that he grew up in. And as a result of that, whenever I would ask George to locate something, he was a parts manager at a Chrysler dealership in Nanaimo in British Columbia up on Vancouver Island. Whenever I would ask him to locate something, if it involved a church, he would say, well, there's some kind of religious institution there, but I can't get anything about it. He just had a very unhappy experience, having been humiliated in front as a little boy in front of this congregation, and he just had nothing. He had nothing to say about that. I did a study about twins, and I had one twin go out to one place, outbound experiment, and the other twin stayed with me. And I asked him it was Halloween, and I asked him to describe where his twin brother was. And he very accurately described, he said, he's in this place where there are these orange pumpkins, but the twin had gone into a tent where there were, typical Halloween pictures of demons, and it was one of those kind of things. But he couldn't describe it. He said, my brother's gone into something, but I can't describe it. And when it was all over and we were going over the experiment, I said to the brother, I just happened to think of it, are you religious? He said, oh, yes, very. And I said, well, what religion? And he said, oh, well, I'm an evangelical. And of course, from an evangelical's point of view, he doesn't want to talk about demons. And so, yes, you are influenced by your biases when you open to non-local consciousness. Some people overcome that. They train themselves to put that aside. Not everybody can do that. So yes, as the information non-locally comes into your local mind, it can be biased by your personality, interests and fears and whatever. I had another remote viewer who didn't like violence. I didn't know that, and I asked her we were doing a murder that had been committed, to solve the murder, and she described very accurately the house where the murder had taken place, but could not go inside into the room where the murder had taken place. So yes, you do have biases, but you can overcome those biases through training, because again, what happens is the bias is like static on your ability to open to non-local consciousness. So it's like, it's like having two radio stations next to each other and one of them overpowers the other. So that does happen. But again, it's not about going, it's about opening. And what you come away with, you realize, is that behind everything, just as Max Planck said, behind everything we think of as being reality is this information architecture in the non-local domain.
An infinite data field of consciousness all around us, right?
It's not all around us. We are a manifestation of the intentioned consciousness of that domain. Again, Planck, consciousness, space-time arises from consciousness, not consciousness from space-time. See, the materialist view is that your mind is a function of your brain, dead meat, no consciousness. But we know from the millions of people who've had near-death experiences, we know from the mediumship research, we know from the reincarnational research, we know from the remote viewing research that there is a continuity of consciousness. And once you begin to think about that, then you recognize that all consciousness is interdependent and interconnected, and that we don't live on the earth, we live in the matrix of consciousness, which is the earth. And so our treatment of other parts of the matrix, which we pollute or whatever, when we do that, we harm the matrix. We throw it into imbalance. So that's what we're doing now in climate change. We are creating climate change, and we're not doing what we should be doing to resolve it. What's going to happen in the future is we're going to have a whole bunch of new technologies that are going to arise which support the health and well-being of the matrix, as opposed to being developed just to make profit. Because the principal problem we have as a culture is that we have only one social priority, and that's profit. Whereas we know from the research, again, I am a data person. All I care about is objectively verifiable facts. And when you look at them, you see that social policies which support and foster well-being always are the best choices. They're the most efficient, most effective, most productive, nicest to live under, and by far the cheapest. And so once you, in order to really get what remote viewing is trying to tell us, is that we are beings of consciousness who are in a matrix of consciousness in which all consciousness is interdependent and interconnected. And we know from, for instance, the therapeutic intention research that people can alter the well-being of individuals or bacteria or fungus. We can change the molecular structure of water through therapeutic intention. I did a whole study on changing the molecular structure of water. Now, how does that happen? And the answer is because in the matrix, we are all interdependent and interconnected. And that's what this is all about, and remote viewing is just one aspect of it.
Now, when it comes to the protocols that you created and had a hand in creating, what are those like? How do those differ from what Ego Swan created?
Well, in fact, Ingo Swan was one of my viewers. So he participated in a whole series. As I said, my interest from the beginning was not the typical laboratory study of I'm going to show you a target tomorrow, can you, or whatever, can you, or I'm going to show you the target now, and can you describe it? That's the typical laboratory level of remote viewing. I was interested in is there some practical application, and so most of my experiments, not all, I did, as I said, I tested 23,000 people doing laboratory remote viewing. Just I'm going to show you a target, describe it for me. But the bulk of my research and the principal focus of my research was describing things all triple blind, and in the archaeological stuff or the criminological work, or was describing things that had a practical utility, and also looking at creativity. I studied people who have moments of creative genius. That's why what I was telling you earlier. When you look at what they say happened to them, what you see or what you hear is the same thing that remote viewers tell you. I had this image. It just came to me. I don't know where. And I just suddenly had this knowing about information that I had not previously known. Or I had an image of this artwork that I had never done before, or whatever. Or religious, St. Teresa of Avila, I have this meditation, and I suddenly had this experience of what I would call non-local consciousness. If you look at the near-death people who describe Eben Alexander, for instance, or they describe this experience of going into another domain.
Well, that's what the Monroe Institute was trying to do, right? Is create an out-of-body experience.
Bob Monroe, I knew Bob well. Bob, sort of, who was in the radio business, basically, originally, sort of stumbled across this experience that you could quiet down the manipulation of your neuroanatomy and all that random thinking by these techniques that he developed, and you could open to this other aspect of consciousness. And so, when you look at this work, and particularly when you look at it across centuries, you see that different cultures in different geographies at different times all develop some technique which they may have believed was the technique, but in fact when you see it across the span of history, you realize that all these techniques were all doing the same thing, and that is teaching people how to attain and sustain intention-focused awareness so that they can open to the non-local aspect of their consciousness, which is the fundamental part of your consciousness. It's the part that existed before you were born. It's the part that is with you all your life, and it's the part that will be continuing after you're dead.
That was like Monroe was doing the hemisync, right, where they put two different tones on each side of your head and tried to.
Yeah, that was one of the that was his technique to develop. There's another fellow that developed another technique using a tone, which I've used. I've used both of them, which helps people move into non-local consciousness. As I said, there are lots and lots of ways to do this, because fundamentally you are a being of consciousness. That's the point. So there's any number of ways to do it. There's all kinds of meditation techniques, and and they have belief structures that are tied into them, whether they're religious or not. All this stuff, it's all about becoming aware and opening to the non-local aspect of your consciousness.
What do you think about the Far Side Institute?
I don't know. They're another example. I guess that would be the best thing I can say.
I mean, do you think that they're accurate? Do you think that they're doing good work, or no?
I don't know enough about it. I don't know enough about what they are currently doing to answer the question.
Okay, thank you. I was just curious because a bunch of people hit me up all the time asking me to interview people from the Far Side Institute, and I don't know
Oh,
enough about it either. So that's why I just thought I would ask really quick.
no, but what I've learned is what I've told you is there are all kinds of people who think they've got the way. This is the way. We have discovered the secret sauce that will give you this access better than anything else in the world. But the fact is, I look at this across thousands of years. I mean, I've been studying this. You know, the oldest near-death experience is in Plato. The oldest remote viewing is in Herodotus. The oldest dowsing perception, dowsing was used to locate the minerals in Germany in the 11th century. I mean, or you go to China and you see how the Chinese approach or the Japanese approach of meditation or the Hindu approach. It, all of them are trying to get to the same place, and that is to recognize that consciousness is causal and fundamental, that you are a being of consciousness who lives in a matrix of consciousness.
Now, from my understanding, you have remote viewed and you've put together a group of people that has remote viewed the future. You've talked about that a lot, but have you remote viewed anything in the past?
In the past?
Yeah, something in the past that's of significance that you could talk about?
Well, I've located all kinds of things in the past. Reconstructing the history of Alexandria, locating Cleopatra's tomb, Mark Antony's tomb, the Pompeii Pillar, the Lighthouse of Pharos, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, locating one of Columbus's caravels from his fourth voyage, locating the brig Leander, locating, oh Lord, I mean, yeah, lots and lots. Because, again, time in the non-local is an information enricher, an informer. It's a piece of data, but it is not a limitation. It is as easy to describe something in the past as it is something in the present. Now, the one thing I don't know, and I'm now currently running an experiment to see if I can get an answer, is when a person describes the future, are they describing a fixed future, or are they describing the highest probability future at the moment I'm asking the question? And I don't know the answer to that yet. But what I can tell you is that you can describe things in the past. It doesn't matter how many years back. I mean, I haven't gone more than 4,000 years back, but it doesn't make any difference. You can go to my personal site, StephanASchwartz.com, and you can watch George McMillan and Hella Hammond locate the film. I film all this stuff. Locate a buried building that has been lost for at least 2,000 years. And they locate it and describe things in the building down to 5/16 of an inch. And this is a building located in a place that was previously surveyed electronically, and they said there was nothing there. And in fact, although I didn't realize this until I was well into it, none of the sites that we located in all of these studies that I've done was capable of being located by side scan sonars, proton precession magnetometers, ground penetrating radars try to look for these things that the remote viewers find, and the remote viewers find them accurately, but you can't find them electronically. So where is the information? And the answer is, it's not anywhere. It's in the non-local domain. And when these people sit with me or wherever they are, and they give me these answers to these questions, can you locate this site? Can you describe for me what's at the site in as great detail as you can? Where do they go? They don't go anywhere. They open to the non-local domain where all of this information is part of the architecture that we call reality.
Now, have you remote viewed anything off of the planet before?
No, I've never done it because I only do things where you can. Bingo Swan and Harold Sherman did viewing of Mercury, Mars, and I think it was Mercury, Mars, Jupiter, and Venus. I think I have that right. This is back in the 70s. And they accurately described what would be found by the subsequent space probes. This was well before the space probes got there. They accurately described things which contradicted what science thought about those places, those planets, but they turned correct. And that's one of the ways we know that distance doesn't matter. I would do more, but you have to be able to. I'm only interested in things which you can objectively verify. So unless I know there's a space probe going out to do it, there's no point. It's like people, all kinds of remote viewings about telling people about extraterrestrials and all that, but I have no way to test that, so that doesn't interest me.
Absolutely. I appreciate that a lot. We got a little bit more time here, and I wanted to get into some of the things that you saw in the future, though I'm not a political show at all. I don't really bring politics into my show whatsoever, but you're breaking up really, really bad. So we're probably going to have to cut it short here a little bit. But if you could briefly talk about, before we close up, what the future was like and what you've seen happen in the future before I let you go.
Well, I'll give you one thing. Something is going to happen between 2040 and 2045, which is going to fundamentally change human civilization. I don't know what it is yet. I think it's actually a combination of things. One, climate change and what that's going to do. Two, the end of the internal combustion engine. Three, the additional pandemics as viruses mutate to accommodate the changed circumstances. And the one that I'm looking at right now is the rise of Homo superior, a new species created by CRISPR technology, which will be mostly done by rich people, and I am very concerned that you create a subspecies of rich people who are smarter, more athletic, don't get heart disease or diabetes or cancer, and what will that do? But in any case, between 2040 and 2045, something really dramatic happens.
Did you see this Homo superior having any kind of technological enhancements, or what is it, just all gene editing and CRISPR technology?
It's genetic editing that is gene lining, so it's passed on from generation to generation. I've written about it. You can go to academia.edu, find all my papers, just search on Homo superior and you'll see my papers on that.
Awesome. Thanks so much. I really appreciate you a lot for coming on my show. Sorry we had to cut it a little short. You're just breaking up there really, really badly.
I don't understand why.
I would like to bring you back on sometime in the future. We can get a little bit longer of an interview going here tonight, but it's kind of getting really weird here. But be
Well,
sure
we've done
to
over an hour, so
yeah,
we're in good shape.
yeah, no problem. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you. The links to Stephan's information will be in the description of this video. For everyone else, thanks for watching and listening. Much love to everyone in the chat. Please be sure to hit the thumbs up button to help the channel out in the YouTube algorithm. Share, subscribe, hit the bell icon as well for notifications. And remember, we're not only in a spiritual war, but a war on humanity. Stay aware, stay alert, keep loving your heart for everyone. Stay safe out there. And if you can see through the illusion, you are the solution. See you guys next time.